locally. And I got a letter just about 2 months ago from a African-American teacher in a Mississippi school. And what she was saying is that she just feels, and she's been there for 16 years, she feels embattled. She feels like she has to constantly defend having Black History Month to white parents. Her administration doesn't believe her when she points out that there are racial disparities in discipline. And there's just this absolute refusal to accept the validity of her point of view and her experience.
Right, yeah.
So we really have to have educational institutions that recognize that emphasize perspective taking. That's got to be one of the goals of education, not only for students, but also for the people who are teaching them. That they really understand that their perspective is not the only one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I first want to tell you, I really appreciate you pointing out that teaching is the #1 occupation among African American males with at least a bachelor's degree. That's something that I wrote in one of my Root articles, and something that's been completely missing from this entire debate on why there are few African American male teachers. And it really boils down to the pipeline from high school to college, not from college into the profession. So thank you for pointing that out. You also brought up a lot of very important points about why we need diversity in schools, why things aren't right now. And you know, it's easy for me to understand, and you know, in an organization like yours, you know, I can only imagine what kind of conversation you all have during lunch. But I suspect that you don't have someone who just came from the Heritage Foundation joining you for dialogue. But when we talk outside of our more progressive circles, and I remember talking to someone about. You know, he was saying that any type of race selection is flat out unfair. And I asked him, I said, well, how do you feel about advantages to students who are legacy? Are advantages to students whose parents have given large sums of money to the university? Are advantages to students with athletic abilities? And for some reason, all of those non-merit-based selections were fine for him, but race wasn't. Where do you think that idea comes from, and how do we talk to people like that?
I think that's one of the most difficult conversations to have, because, you know, those of us who are progressives are going to answer that it really comes down to the idea of white privilege, which is kind of invisible to the people who hold it.
Right.
And frankly, nobody really wants to hear, especially people who feel like they're struggling. It's been a terrible economy for the last 5 years, you know, who feel that they're seeing their middle class status erode, for instance. They don't want to hear that they're privileged.
Right.
So I think that I always talk about kind of public values in that sense, that, you know, and try to point out the positive value that these schools, particularly public universities, we're supporting them with taxpayer dollars, not so that people who already, you know, have advantages can continue to be more advantaged, but because we expect to get some kind of return that's good for society. And so for society, well, do we really want to live in a society where one's race kind of also, in too many instances, correlates to socioeconomic status in a negative way? Do we really want to have that kind of lingering bitterness that's this legacy? Don't we want, what kind of generation, what kind of future do we want for our children?
Right.
And do we want a society, whether it's in our own state or the nation or our own local community, that is reflective of all of us, that really does move closer to that goal? And part of the problem, I think, is that we have really started looking at education as a private good. It's something that parents purchase in some ways for their children, and that the only person who benefits is my child.
Right.
And that I should have choice. And the same thing getting into public colleges or to any college, it's based on some kind of meritocracy, and I've earned it. Well, we also have responsibilities to the rest of to the rest of the community.
Right.
And that is to help to invest in the rest of the community. We are already a diverse nation. We're going to be much more diverse. And we have to educate people for the future.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good point. And one of the overarching things that I heard in your response was that affirmative action is good for all. It's not good for one particular group. It's good for the entire nation. And I think that is something that needs to be emphasized. And in many ways, it seems like universities have already, by and large, bought into the idea that at least some measure of diversity is good for what they want to achieve. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah, and it, it also appears that in the past there may have been this federal enforcement of affirmative action. We had the feds coming in and protecting the black student who was integrating the schools. We don't have that kind of federal enforcement of affirmative action anymore. By and large, affirmative action is delivered by the schools for their own interests. And so it's a bit of an irony that a lot of aspects of the United States who are typically anti-federal enforcement, anti-federal intervention, now they want the feds to come in and regulate what the University of Texas wants to do, or any other university. So I just thought that was a pretty interesting dynamic. It's not necessarily a question, but I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Well, I find that ideals like one's allegiance to federalism pretty much depend on what is really at issue.
Right.
I agree that it's become something that universities have embraced, and that the conversation, including the legal conversation, has moved from correcting an injustice to creating a situation that has a positive good.
Right.
And that, I think, has to be where we keep focusing.
Yeah.
The reality is that, those folks really, you're right, those folks really want the federal government to step in and tell the University of Texas that it can't do what it's doing, when the trustees of the University of Texas and the people who govern it have decided that that's really a good thing for them to carry out their educational mission.
Yeah. All right. So the last question, or maybe a few questions that's kind of embedded in this that I want to address is, what happens if affirmative action leaves us? Because, like I said in the initial opening, although the Supreme Court did not strike down affirmative action, they clearly laid out a foundation for affirmative action to conceivably not exist. And so it is, do you agree with that?
I'm going to do a disclaimer now. I am not a lawyer.
Right.
However, I agree. I mean, what I read of the opinion and what I've heard is that they're saying race should be a factor only as a last resort. And that certainly seems troubling. On the other hand, I've also as I've read, I've seen that they've upheld lots of the case law that they've already decided over the last 30 years.
Right.
So they really didn't overturn it.
Yeah.
But as I said, I'm not a lawyer. And I would like to actually turn it around a little bit. I think don't do more at the K-12 level. We have less chance to do good at the higher ed level. Right. What we really need to do as a society at large, and in terms of policy, is looking at K-12. It's unfortunate, but since Brown versus the Board of Education, our schools have once again become more segregated.
Yes.
And they've become more segregated because we're more segregated in housing patterns than we had been. And of course, there have been a variety of school reform movements that ironically have actually increased the segregation. Right. One of the most shocking things that I found when I moved here to Montgomery, and as you can hear, I'm not from Montgomery, is the discovery that there is, in effect, two school systems. The public schools are majority African American, And as a person who sold me real estate told me, we've got low property taxes here, and we've got the schools to prove it. In a kind of sardonic and embarrassed way, but it was still kind of said there, right out front. And then what you have is a whole bunch of private schools that were founded sometime between 1858 and 1862 that most middle-class white families send their children to. So you've got that kind of thing going on in the South. You've got many, many communities throughout the nation where schools have become increasingly segregated, and most African-American children will go to schools that are majority African-American.
Right.
I think that, and of course then, and you know this, so we're talking, we're members of the same choir here, but we're looking at, they're going to schools that are probably underfunded because we really haven't looked at the equitable funding formulas across the nation. We haven't tackled them. Too often, if they're in districts that include middle class or white majority schools, they don't get the strongest teaching staff. They don't get the strongest administrators assigned to them. The children there may be offered, quote unquote, the same educational opportunities, but they have many greater needs. And so if we don't start addressing those problems, we're creating the need to have continued affirmative action policies that some people are not going to like. And I think we just need to, for the sake of those children and for all of our children, to start making changes earlier. And I would say before K, actually, in early childhood.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. And one of the interesting things that I've heard about the Texas system, where they have the top 10% rule, someone told me, and I don't have the numbers to back this up, but someone from Texas told me that when they originally started that process, there were a lot of people who were against affirmative action that thought that process would correct itself, because they felt like if you take someone in the top 10% at, in an inner city public school in Houston, Texas, they just wouldn't measure up. And so at a certain point, you'll see these, top 5% students flunking out of the University of Texas because their schools were inferior, and the University of Texas would have to rethink the way that they were approaching it. But in fact, those students did just as well as any other students. So it's it's a testament to the resilience of a lot of these kids, that they can come from a school environment that are under resourced, like you just described, and still go to a school like University of Texas and compete with these students at some of the most elite high schools in Texas. But you're absolutely right. We do have to take a closer look at what's going on at the K through 12 level. And I think that we have the same mind as far as a lot of the things that the federal government is focusing their attention on, like the testing and these types of things. Common Core standards are good in theory, but until we go in and say, because you can't force a teacher who doesn't have that much of an academic preparation or background or qualifications or experience, you can't force him or her to teach calculus. So at one point you have to look at equity issues, and that's one of the things Common Core standards don't really seem to do. They don't really seem to look at the pure nuts and bolts of the school. Does your school have an adequate counselor to student ratio? Does your school have teachers who are qualified to teach the classes that they are assigned to teach? Do they have the type of curriculum that would make them competitive to go to a university that requires calculus and physics and things like that? So that's the kind of standards I would really like to see that they're not talking about. What are your final thoughts on this? Beyond affirmative action, what do people who are in the space to advocate, our parents who are just concerned, what should we be doing?
I think we just have to keep